The torchlight doesn't just flicker, it shudders against the damp stone, painting twisted shadows that writhe like dying souls. In the distance, church bells toll not in triumph, but like a dirge for sanity itself. Now imagine a king not cloaked in glory, but cowering in his chambers, shivering at the brush of a hand, convinced his body is nothing but fragile glass that could splinter with a single touch. This is not myth. This is the reign of Charles VI of France, a monarch consumed by madness so grotesque it poisoned his bloodline and dragged a kingdom into chaos. Tonight we walk into a nightmare where power and delusion intertwine, where the throne itself became a prison of shattered reason. And before we peel back the veil on this horror, make sure you hit subscribe, because the truths you're about to witness will not fade when the story ends. They will haunt you long after the screen goes dark. Charles was crowned at the tender age of 11, a boy surrounded by towering uncles and scheming courtiers. In the beginning, the court saw him as a golden child, a prince destined to bring stability after years of turmoil. His coronation was a dazzling spectacle, the streets flooded with cheering crowds and the scent of incense rising like hope itself. Yet hidden beneath the glitter of crowns and jewels was a storm waiting to consume both the boy and the realm he was bound to rule. For years, Charles carried the image of a promising king, young, handsome, and generous. He loved tournaments, hunting, and processions that displayed France's splendor. But the burdens of the throne weighed heavily, and cracks began to appear in his mind long before anyone recognized the danger. Rumors whispered of sleepless nights, sudden outbursts of temper, and a strange fear that sometimes made him recoil from those closest to him, as though their touch carried doom. The tipping point came in the summer of 1392. Charles, leading an army through the forest of Le Mans, suddenly fell into a frenzy. In the burning heat of the sun, as cicadas screamed from the trees, he turned on his own guards. With a sword raised high, the king slashed through men who had sworn their lives to him. Horses reared in panic, steel clashed against steel, and the air filled with screams as brother turned against brother, all because their king had lost control. Those who survived recounted the horror with trembling voices. Charles's eyes rolled, white foam flecked his mouth, and he raged like a man possessed. He struck down 4 men, nearly killing his own brother before being wrestled to the ground. When the madness passed, Charles collapsed in exhaustion, his royal robes stained with blood, not of enemies, but of his most loyal protectors. From that day forward, the French court would never know peace again. Whispers spread quickly. Some blamed sorcery, others claimed the devil himself had seized the king's mind. Priests murmured prayers. Nobles argued behind closed doors, and peasants looked to the heavens with dread. Was their monarch cursed? Or worse, was the entire kingdom now under God's wrath? The event in the forest was no isolated frenzy. It was the beginning of an unrelenting descent into madness. In the weeks that followed, Charles refused to bathe, refused to change his clothes, and often fled from mirrors, as though his own reflection mocked him. Servants were ordered not to touch him, for he cried that their hands would break his fragile body into shards. He dressed himself in reinforced garments, padded and stiff, so that if he stumbled, his imagined glass bones would not shatter. The court looked on with terror and pity, realizing that their king no longer saw himself as flesh and blood. By night, the corridors of the palace echoed with his cries. Witnesses claimed he spoke to shadows, begged unseen enemies not to strike, and sometimes wept like a child, muttering that he was nothing more than fragile crystal. In these moments, Charles was no longer king. He was a prisoner of delusion, locked in a body he believed would splinter with the slightest touch. His attendants tiptoed through the halls, terrified of both his madness and his rage. The Queen Isabeau of Bavaria tried at first to shield him from ridicule, but whispers of the Glass King reached every corner of Europe. Diplomats smirked behind their hands. Nobles plotted openly, and rival factions saw opportunity in the king's madness. France, once united under its young monarch, now fractured into dangerous factions. The Burgundians and the Armagnacs, each seeking to control the fragile puppet on the throne. The people of Paris, who once adored Charles, now watched in despair as their sovereign hid away like a ghost. Taxes rose, wars dragged on, and famine stalked the land, while their king believed himself to be no more than brittle glass. A monarch's madness had become a nation's tragedy, and the streets whispered a chilling prophecy that France itself would shatter, just as surely as the mind of its ruler. As months turned to years, the king's episodes grew more violent and unpredictable. At times, he forgot his own name and failed to recognize his wife or children. Courtiers recorded moments when Charles demanded to be locked in chambers for fear that assassins waited behind every curtain. Other times, he sprinted through the palace halls like a hunted animal, shrieking at the walls as though they were closing in on him. The palace had become not a home, but a haunted labyrinth of his own mind. One chilling account tells of Charles sitting motionless for hours, his eyes wide and unblinking until a servant accidentally brushed his sleeve. In an instant, he screamed with such force that the court froze in terror. He believed that his body had cracked, that shards of himself lay scattered on the marble floor. Desperate attendants scrambled to assure him that he was whole, even pretending to collect invisible pieces to calm his terror. These grotesque rituals became part of life in the royal household. The queen's position grew precarious. Isabeau of Bavaria was blamed by many for the king's decline. Some accused her of infidelity, others of witchcraft. Pamphlets circulated depicting her as a she-wolf preying on France. She attempted to maintain stability, but every decision was shadowed by whispers that she ruled through deceit. In truth, she faced an impossible choice: protect her husband's shattered dignity or seize power to save the realm from collapse. Meanwhile, France's enemies sharpened their knives. England watched eagerly, waiting for the chance to strike, while within France, the Duke of Burgundy and the Armagnac faction prepared for open war. The people, peasants, merchants, priests paid the price. Taxes doubled, soldiers roamed the countryside unchecked, and famine hollowed bellies. For them, the king was no longer a symbol of hope, but a living curse, a reminder that God had abandoned their land. Charles's delusions of fragility sometimes gave way to sudden savage rages. Witnesses described him leaping to his feet, eyes wild as he struck attendants or accused noblemen of plotting against him. These outbursts left courtiers trembling, unsure if the next moment would bring laughter or bloodshed. The palace, once filled with music and diplomacy, became a stage for unpredictable horror, where even the highest nobles feared for their lives in the presence of their sovereign. Yet there were moments, brief, fragile, when clarity returned. In these rare intervals, Charles wept bitterly, confessing that he was trapped inside a prison of madness he could not escape. He begged his doctors for cures, enduring endless rituals of bleeding herbal concoctions and whispered prayers. None brought relief. Each failure deepened the despair, convincing him further that he was doomed to live as glass, fragile and cursed. The image of the Glass King spread across Europe. Scholars debated his condition. Poets mocked him in verses, and foreign ambassadors reported his affliction with both pity and ridicule. To his enemies, he was a symbol of weakness. To his people, he was both an object of sorrow and a dangerous liability. France was being pulled apart at the seams, and its ruler could no longer bind it together. In Paris, common folk gathered in taverns to share grotesque stories of the king's behavior. Some claimed he wandered the streets, disguised, speaking nonsense to beggars. Others said he refused to move from chairs for days, terrified that rising would cause his legs to splinter. Whether truth or exaggeration, these tales painted the portrait of a monarch lost to insanity. They fueled the belief that France's crown had become not a blessing but a curse passed down through generations. The court attempted desperate measures to shield Charles's image. Portraits showed him serene, dignified, almost divine. Public ceremonies were staged where he appeared calm though carefully guarded. But behind the curtains, attendants whispered of rooms reeking with neglect, of a king who tore at his own clothes, who screamed into the night, and who begged unseen tormentors for mercy. The mask of kingship could not hide the reality forever. By the dawn of the 15th century, the kingdom was not ruled by its monarch, but by factions battling in his name. Every decree, every treaty, every tax bore the shadow of manipulation. France had a body crowned in jewels, but a mind shattered like broken glass. And with each passing year, the people's patience eroded, leaving behind only anger, despair, and the dreadful certainty that worse was yet to come. The Duke of Burgundy moved like a shadow through the court, promising order where chaos reigned, while the Armagnac lords swore loyalty to the royal bloodline over any usurper. Between them lay a sickened monarch whose signature could doom a city. And so Paris became a chessboard, where bishops, bankers, and mercenaries traded favors in whispers, and every candlelit council ended with knives drawn just out of sight. On winter nights, the Seine carried rumors like fog the king had demanded. Iron braces sewn into his clothing to protect his glass ribs. A blacksmith summoned to the palace at midnight to craft a strange garment of padded leather and riveted plates. The man emerged at dawn, pale and shaking, swearing he had outfitted not a warrior but a reliquary for a saint made of crystal. Isabeau, calculating and cornered, gathered advisors in a perfumed chamber where the tapestries muffled fear. She spoke of regency, of safeguarding the Dauphin, of treaties that could buy peace long enough for the king to heal. Yet every syllable drew accusations like moths to flame: adulteress, sorceress, foreign snake, until she learned to speak softly and wield power with the quiet efficiency of a surgeon's knife. Meanwhile, physicians bled the king beneath smoky lamplight, counting drops, as if sanity could be measured in crimson beads. Apothecaries pounded herbs into bitter paste, monks pressed relics to his brow, and astrologers charted the sky for favorable hours. But the only stars the king recognized were the glimmering fractures he imagined radiating across his chest whenever a servant came too near. In one rare lucid dawn, Charles ordered the chapel bells rung for a Thanksgiving Mass. The court gleamed with timid smiles until a page stumbled on the threshold and brushed the royal sleeve, and the king lurched back with a cry, like breaking crystal, demanding the shards be gathered. Knees scraped. Raw lords and ladies crawled across the floor, cupping empty hands, murmuring, "Here, sire, your pieces are safe," while the organ droned a hymn of hollow victory. Beyond the palace, wolves circled villages emptied by famine and tax collectors. Mothers shushed children with lullabies about the glass king who mustn't be touched, as if gentleness alone could keep roofs from collapsing and fields from burning, and priests preached patience while counting the coin that mercenaries would soon pry from their fingers anyway. A masked friar, some called him prophet. Others' spy appeared at court with a parchment of omens written in ink that smelled faintly of myrrh. He warned that a monarch of glass would invite iron from across the sea, and that the lilies of France would bow to a foreign lion. The parchment was dismissed as superstition, but copies bloomed through taverns like mold on damp walls. The Burgundian faction staged a triumph in Paris. Banners, rippling drums thundering through narrow streets, while secret riders galloped south with Armagnac letters begging loyal towns to bar their gates. The king heard the celebration from behind drapes and asked with a child's baffled softness whether the music could crack him if it grew too loud. No one dared answer. On a rain-slashed night, a courier arrived from the North Cloak, pasted to his back, bringing word that English ships massed like black teeth along the coast. The council chamber stank of wet wool and fear, and a chamberlain's quill scratched out a decree in the king's name, though the king was miles away inside himself, counting the fault lines in his forearm by candlelight. Paris learned a new rhythm. Morning executions in the square. As factions settled grudges, noon proclamations promising stability. Twilight funerals carried in silence down alleys where the cobbles drank everything. And after midnight, when even the rats slept, a single lantern moved past shuttered windows, The captain of the royal guards making his rounds, whispering a prayer that he would not be the next loyal man to die beneath a sovereign who could no longer tell flesh from glass. By now, the royal palace reeked not of incense or victory feasts, but of mildew sweat and the sour stench of despair. Attendants tiptoed through corridors where tapestries sagged like tired sentinels, each of them praying that the king would not summon them for some impossible task, such as retrieving splinters of his imagined body or stitching invisible cracks with golden thread. One chronicler described a night when Charles demanded that the hearth be extinguished, convinced that the heat would warp his glass form. The hall plunged into cold darkness, courtiers shivering in silence as their monarch sat stiff and pale, whispering that the fire's breath was a hammer raised against him. The servants obeyed their frozen fingers, trembling too hard to strike flint until dawn. At court banquets, when foreign envoys were present, Charles sometimes appeared resplendent in silks, smiling with eerie calm. Yet those who sat near him saw the strain in his eyes, the way his hand hovered nervously above the table, afraid that lifting a goblet too swiftly might fracture his wrist. Behind the music and roasted meats, dread gnawed at everyone present. The facade could crumble at any second. Meanwhile, the queen's enemies grew bolder. Rumors claimed that Isabeau spent her nights not in prayer for her husband, but in the arms of courtiers and dukes. Whether truth or slander, the effect was the same. Nobles muttered that the queen had abandoned the king to his madness, trading France's dignity for her own survival. The people began to spit her name like a curse in the marketplaces. Outside Paris, soldiers roamed unchecked, burning crops, demanding tribute and branding villages with the scars of civil war. The peasants, starving and broken, carved crude graffiti into church doors, images of a king made of glass shattering beneath the weight of his own crown. It was their way of mourning a sovereign they no longer recognized. Charles's children lived in a strange twilight between royal privilege and constant dread. The Dauphin, still a boy, learned to read state documents under the watch of wary tutors, while his father muttered to himself in shadowed chambers. At night, the children sometimes heard their father's screams echo through the palace, the sound of a monarch dissolving into terror. Doctors continued their futile experiments. One physician swore that placing crushed emeralds in wine would cure madness. Another demanded that the king's blood be mixed with honey and consumed as a potion. Each ritual failed, leaving Charles weaker, more haunted, and more convinced that his body was a vessel cursed to break. The court began to look less like a place of governance and more like an alchemist's workshop of desperation. And yet there were fleeting moments of heartbreaking clarity. In one, Charles reportedly clasped his daughter's hand and whispered, "Do not touch too tightly, my child, for I may shatter. But know that I love you." Then, as quickly as a candle snuffed by wind, his gaze glazed over, and he recoiled as though her tiny fingers were daggers piercing fragile crystal. The rival factions seized upon every episode. The Burgundians pointed to his madness as proof that only their steady hand could guide France, while the Armagnacs insisted the bloodline must remain sacred regardless of the king's condition. Each faction claimed to protect France, but in truth they carved it apart like vultures fighting over the bones of a dying beast. By the year 1407, Paris itself became a battleground. Streets ran with blood as Burgundian assassins struck down the Duke of Orleans, plunging the realm deeper into chaos. The king, when informed, stared blankly and muttered only that broken glass could never be repaired. His madness had become more than a private tragedy. It was now the very symbol of France's collapse. The assassination of the Duke of Orleans marked a turning point, for it showed the world that France was no longer ruled by law but by blades in the night. Pamphlets spread through Paris depicting the king as a hollow figure made of glass shards, unable to protect even his own kin, and the people whispered that perhaps the crown itself was cursed. In taverns and markets, stories of the Glass King grew more grotesque with each retelling. Some claimed he refused to move for days, believing his feet had splintered into the floorboards. Others swore he wrapped himself in blankets until he resembled a cocoon, whispering that he would emerge only when the cracks in his body healed. Truth blurred with rumor. But all agreed on one thing: their king was lost to madness. The queen, weary of defending him, turned her focus to alliances. She negotiated with Burgundians one week, Armagnacs the next, promising loyalty while secretly plotting her own survival. Her duplicity fueled hatred, but it also kept the throne balanced on a razor's edge, preventing total collapse, at least for a time. Meanwhile, the countryside burned. Soldiers loyal to one faction raided farms, while rival armies retaliated with equal cruelty. Villagers were hanged from trees, their corpses left as warnings, and fields were salted so nothing could grow. For peasants, the madness of their king was not a distant tragedy, but the very reason their lives were swallowed by famine and fire. In 1410, Charles suffered one of his longest fits. For nearly 6 months, he could not recognize his queen, his children, or even himself. He wandered the palace in rags, mumbling that he was no more than shattered glass scattered across the floor. His attendants feared he would die, but instead he lingered, a hollow shadow of a man, while France spiraled further into chaos. Foreign powers seized their chance. England under Henry V sharpened its ambitions, preparing to strike, while France was divided and weak. Envoys returned to London with reports of the Glass King, who could not ride, could not fight, could barely speak. For England, this madness was not a horror, it was an invitation. In one eerie tale, Charles was found sitting before a mirror, staring with wide eyes. When asked what he saw, he whispered, "1,000 cracks, each one a path for the devil to enter." He then smashed the mirror with a sudden howl, cutting his hands on the shards, yet smiling faintly, as though the wounds confirmed what he already believed, that he was made of glass, doomed to break. As the years bled on, the people grew numb. To them, madness at the top was no longer shocking but expected. They prayed not for the king's recovery, but for an end to the wars his weakness had unleashed. The crown had become a burden, a symbol not of unity but of suffering, and some whispered that France would be better without a king at all. The Dauphin, Charles's heir, watched his father's decline with silent dread. He learned to mask fear with formality, to bow in public while whispering rage in private. Though still young, he knew that the kingdom he would inherit was fractured beyond repair, and that his father's madness had carved scars across France that no ruler could heal quickly. By the time the English marched toward Agincourt, France was a kingdom in name only. Behind its walls sat a monarch convinced he was fragile glass, a queen mistrusted by her people, and factions tearing each other apart like rabid dogs. The stage was set for disaster, and the legacy of the Glass King was about to become not just a private nightmare, but a national catastrophe. The year 1415 brought the nightmare to its bloody climax at Agincourt. French knights, weighed down by pride and steel, sank into the mud while English arrows cut them down like stalks of wheat. Thousands perished, and though Charles VI was not present, his madness hovered over the battlefield like a curse. Soldiers muttered that their king's shattered mind had cursed their swords to break and their shields to fail. When word of the disaster reached Paris, the city groaned under the weight of grief. Mothers wept in doorways, fathers cursed the heavens, and children whispered that perhaps God had abandoned France because its king no longer knew himself. Charles, upon hearing the reports, merely stared blankly and muttered that broken glass could never protect anyone. The Queen and her advisors, desperate, sought treaties with England. For them, survival mattered more than pride. But to the people, every negotiation smelled of betrayal. They saw a monarchy that could not defend them, a crown bartered like cheap coin, and a queen whose loyalty seemed more fluid than the Seine itself. In 1419, the murder of John, the fearless Duke of Burgundy, once again plunged France into chaos. Paris became a theater of vengeance, with assassins lurking in shadows and mobs rioting in the streets. And still, their king drifted through his palace like a ghost, occasionally laughing at nothing, sometimes weeping and often silent, convinced that his ribs were splintering under the weight of a crown he no longer wore with dignity. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 sealed France's humiliation. By its terms, Charles disinherited his own son and named Henry V of England as heir to the throne of France. Many wept openly, calling it treason. Others spat at the mention of the Glass King, swearing that no true monarch could condemn his own bloodline. The crown of France, once a symbol of strength, was now passed like a cursed relic. The Dauphin, robbed of his birthright, fled south. His bitterness carved him into a figure of defiance, while his father remained in Paris, trapped in delusions. The sight of the king wandering his halls, muttering to invisible cracks, stood in cruel contrast to the image of a proud monarch signing away his kingdom's future. France seemed broken beyond repair. Yet among the people, legends began to stir. Whispers spread of visions of saints who promised salvation. In the darkest taverns and in the fields of starving peasants, hope flickered like a candle guttering in the wind. Though their king was lost to madness, some dared to believe that France itself was not finished, that another hand might one day lift the shattered crown. Charles, meanwhile, sank deeper into delusion. He refused to allow anyone near his bed, claiming that even the weight of a blanket might crush him. He ordered the floors covered in straw so that if he fell, the glass of his body would not break. To his attendants, he was no longer king, but a fragile relic they had to preserve until fate claimed him. Foreign chroniclers wrote of France with pity, some with mockery. "A king of glass rules a kingdom of ashes," one English scribe remarked. The insult stung because it was true. France, fractured by war and betrayal, mirrored the madness of its sovereign. What was once the most powerful crown in Europe now seemed as fragile as the mind that wore it. By the late 1420s, Charles's condition left him scarcely more than a hollow shell. His fits came without warning, his lucidity grew shorter and rarer, and courtiers tiptoed around him like mourners at a funeral. The man who had once been crowned in splendor now lived in shadows, his glass delusion etched forever into the memory of his people, even as the kingdom struggled to rise from the ruins he left behind. As the 1430s dawned, a strange paradox haunted France. Though the king still lived, his presence was more like that of a ghost. Courtiers carried on state affairs in his name, but few had spoken to him in years. When they did, they found only fragments of a man whispering about cracks in his spine or staring at his hands as if light might pass through them. The people began to weave his madness into folklore. Children were warned to tread softly, lest they shatter the king's glass bones, and ballads were sung that mocked him as a fragile phantom. Yet beneath the satire lay sorrow, for everyone knew his suffering was not chosen. He was a monarch betrayed by his own mind, a tragedy too raw to dismiss completely. The Dauphin, now Charles VII, began to rally loyalists in the south. With the help of unlikely figures, most famously Joan of Arc, he rekindled a fire of resistance. The contrast was stark, a son claiming destiny while his father withered away in delusions. France became a battlefield not only of nations but of symbols torn between the broken image of the Glass King and the burning vision of renewal. In Paris, Charles VI remained confined, wandering halls strewn with straw. His attendants whispered that sometimes he laughed at nothing for hours, then suddenly wept, as if the weight of his crown pressed shards into his flesh. Physicians had long given up. Priests visited only to murmur last rites in advance, as though preparing for a death that never quite arrived. By 1429, Joan's victories gave the French people a glimpse of salvation. But the king, lost in delusion, could not share their triumph. When told of her, he muttered only that glass reflects fire, and fire consumes glass. His words, cryptic and chilling, spread through the court as an omen that even miracles might end in ash. The final years of Charles's life blurred together in silence. He seldom spoke, and when he did, his words came fractured like shards of broken glass scattered on the floor. The court carried on without him, already looking toward his son, while the old king sat cloaked in madness, a monarch alive, but long since absent. In October 1422, Charles VI died at the age of 53. The streets of Paris did not erupt in grief, but in uneasy quiet. Some mourned, others sighed with relief, as though the kingdom had finally been released from a curse. The bells tolled not with triumph, but with the hollow echo of a tragedy concluding at last. He was laid to rest in the Basilica of Saint-Denis, his body dressed in royal finery, though those who saw him whispered that the garments looked absurd on a man who had spent years believing himself nothing more than fragile glass. The funeral was somber, attended more out of duty than devotion, for France had endured too much under his reign to truly honor him. And yet his memory refused to fade. Chroniclers preserved his story, poets immortalized his madness, and generations remembered him as the Glass King, a ruler whose delusion became a mirror of his kingdom's fragility. His reign was proof that the fate of nations can hinge not only on swords and treaties, but on the hidden fractures within a single human mind. Even now, the tale of Charles VI lingers like a ghost in France's history. He was not the first mad king nor the last, but his delusion remains the most haunting. To imagine a monarch ruling not with iron will but with the constant terror of shattering into pieces is to glimpse the thin line between power and ruin. And as you leave this story, remember the crown may glitter with gold, but sometimes it is nothing more than glass waiting to break.